The Spanish flu didn't originate in Spain. It's named thus because the virus struck in 1918 at the end of the First World War, and countries didn't want to hurt morale. So they banned any kind of reporting on the pandemic. Spain, which remained neutral and still had a free press, was one of the only European countries to chronicle the pandemic. President Woodrow Wilson failed to ever even mention the flu once in public. Historians say that the lack of a global cohesive narrative about what was happening to people, a lack of truth-telling, and an unwillingness to cooperate, a propensity for finger-pointing and name-calling, and a desire to bury news of yet another calamity on top of a series of calamities meant that the 1918 flu was experienced largely as a series of individual tragedies. In 1920, left in the pandemic's wake, the world population, racked by loss and trauma, turned to one another and said, how do we make sense of what just happened to us? And how do we move forward? Sound familiar? The way that we tell the story of what has happened to us and what is happening to us, that affects what will happen to us. It is hard to remember history as it's taking place, especially when we're isolated in our homes, lacking so much of what makes life normal, feeling our own individual pressures. You know, there's a story from the Talmud about the 2nd century Rabbi Eliezer and his student Rabbi Akiva. The rabbi's community was suffering under its own plague, an oppressive drought, and they begged their leaders for some kind of help. So Rabbi Eliezer led his community in prayer exactly as it was prescribed, and nothing happened. And then Rabbi Akiva, channeling his own fear and heartfelt prayers of that of his community and himself and his family, he stood before the Holy Ark and he said, Avinu Malkeinu Rachem Aleinu. Our parent, our ruler, have mercy upon us. And the rain began to fall. Relief. Oh, sweet relief. This was, according to our tradition, the first time anyone had ever uttered the words Avinu Malkeinu. It is a reminder that our tradition considers words that we utter from our deepest vulnerabilities, that tap into who we are, to be the most efficacious, the realist. We are not the first community to throw open our hands and close tight our eyes and stare up to the heavens and inside of ourselves and say simply help to the universe. The Spanish flu infected 1 out of 3 human beings on Earth. It killed somewhere between 50 to 100 million people, and it is barely remembered as a footnote of the 20th century. Will this be our fate too? Friends, we can't wait to remember our history. We can't wait because our democracy, our collective American identity, our place in the global community, and the well-being of our neighbors, they are all at stake right now. And there are folks in our country who are attempting to write a really different history of our time. Their account exacerbates our divides, seeks to set us against each other, casts blame, spreads hate, and sows distrust. We are 7.5 billion people on this planet, 331 million people in the United States, and we are being brought to our collective knees by a virus that is 10,000 times smaller than the width of a human hair. This moment this moment. This moment, it calls for humility and empathy and connection and courage and moral leadership. A pandemic does not strike alone. Historically, we know pandemics are often accompanied by climate change and civil unrest and conflict and the massive movements of people. People are taking to the streets because there is a pandemic and despite the pandemic. Victims of abuse are coming forward with testimony, and we are listening. People of color are speaking to the racism they have faced in our country, and we are bearing witness. We are waking up to the suffering of our neighbors because we are finally still enough and quiet enough to hear them. We are reaching out to transcend physical distance because in the absence of regular human touch, our souls ache to feel connected. We are all hurting in some way. When folks ask me what comes next, what can I say? I don't know. I don't know what all this will bring or what it will mean or when it will end, but I want to tell you, and I speak this to you straight from my heart, I want this time to bring something good for our country, something good for our planet, something good for our community. What comes next? How about what comes now? Members of the TIOH community are currently partnering with other groups to make and give away 4,000 lunches every Sunday, giving them to the Hollywood Food Coalition to be spread out across the city. Organized by TIOHer Jennifer Levin, along with so many others like Francine Tanzi and Renee Makatel and Andrea Rothschild, this Tzedakah project has proved to be a soothing balm. My family, we've joined many of you in this effort. Our drop-off location is Francine Tanzi's driveway. For my young children, this ritualized weekly delivery at Francine's gate has become a source of profound connection. A few weeks ago, as we approached Francine's house, Max, one of my 3-year-olds, said to me from the back seat, "Mama, is Francine our family?" And in my heart, I said to him, "Oh, yes, Max, she is." Laura Spinney, writing about 1918, but also presciently about today, explains your best chance of survival was to be utterly selfish. Assuming you had a place to call home, the optimal strategy was to stay there, not answer the door, and jealously guard your hoard of food and water and ignore all pleas for help. However, people didn't do this. They reached out to each other, showing what psychologists refer to as collective resilience. Psychologists explain that in life-threatening situations, people's sense of self expands. They no longer identify as individuals, but as members of a group. We help others because our sense of self, it multiplies. And I would wager to guess we have all experienced this expansiveness of self. We've written postcards and we have phone banked. We've connected with family and helped those most at risk. We have cried and we have worried together. We have heard the stories of others, we have volunteered, and we have donated. We are doing all this because doing anything else, feeling anything else, seems contrary to what it means to be human in this moment. We don't shut our eyes. I would guess that for most of us, our eyes have never been this open. In this pandemic, we see the undeniable socioeconomic divides which determine access to resources and healthcare, finances, Wi-Fi, safe working conditions, flexible schedules, food, and education. The overwhelming inequity can feel too much to hold. And that is also part of our pandemic and the history that we have to remember right now. You know, my mom grew up in LA and graduated from high school in 1968. Her family, they struggled financially, sometimes barely scraping by. She told me stories, and these were so important to me as a child, about her shame of being kicked out of religious school because her family couldn't pay temple dues. But my mom went to Hamilton High School, a great public school, and to UCLA after that, paying almost nothing in tuition. She graduated college, became a corporate senior vice president, and retired at the age of 55. My mom told me her origin story often. For her and for me, it was predominantly an object lesson in grit. A story of resilience, not taking no for an answer, belief in oneself, and the ability to achieve anything when we put our minds to it. For my mom, glass ceilings were made to be broken. But one thing has become exceedingly clear to me over these past months. And that's that my mom's story is about community and communal investment as much as it is about individual drive. It's a story about a community that invested in its children and their communities. A state that had social safety nets. And of course, privileged white people. Times were complicated then as they are now. When my mom was in high school, California ranked 5th in the country in per pupil spending. Today, it ranks 43rd. 43rd. 80% of LAUSD students live at or below the poverty line. The pandemic has amplified the question I'm about to ask. What are we doing to care for these children and their parents today? Our federal government has failed us. And we try. We try to fill in the gaps, but the gulf is more that we can bridge on our own. To remain just helpful individuals without structural and communal change ensures that our moment will be lost to history and that we will fail to truly expand our sense of self. Jen Levin says, and that's why making lunches is a problem. No matter how good our actions or our intentions, for this to mean something, we need to act as a collective to make real transformation. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, TIOH joined our community partners in calling on elected officials to pass a just ballot here in Los Angeles. In the end, LA officials took $150 million and reinvested it directly into communities. For me, at the time, nothing felt more pressing. Today, something feels more pressing. Schools and Communities First, or Proposition 15 on this November's ballot, is a ballot measure that the TIOH Social Justice Coalition and our community partners are working to support. If passed, SCF would reform commercial property taxes and raise approximately $12 billion a year for the state of California, $4 billion for Los Angeles, 40% of which would be given directly to K through 12 schools, and 60% would be given to communities. Am I really talking about voting on Rosh Hashanah? Yes, I am, unapologetically, because this isn't about partisanship. It's about justice and the 5781 we want to usher in and the deep spiritual tasks before us. In 1918, New York City's health commissioner, Royal Copeland, wanted to close all the public schools. But Josephine Baker, a health department division head, persuaded him not to. She told Copeland, "I want to see if I can't keep the children in this city away from the danger of flu. I don't know that I can do it, but I would awfully well like to have a chance." And Baker won out. There are a number of reasons why our schools remain closed today. Chief among them is the novel nature of this virus. And our educational system is deeply underfunded. Our public schools simply do not have the resources they need to keep our children and their teachers safe. And so we are scrambling to figure out how to feed hungry children. And we are struggling to get folks impacted by the virus free testing. And we are failing to support working parents who don't have good options for childcare. We are figuring out how we might survive this pandemic as a city and state and nation without losing our souls, sacrificing the poor and disenfranchised among us. Hippocrates, writing in the 5th century BCE, was the first person to use the word epidemic in medical terms. In Latin, epidemic means of the people. Of the people is an apt description. The first epidemics took hold about 12,000 years ago, when our ancestors began to domesticate animals and started to live closer together. It is because we are living as a collective that pandemics take hold. But it is only by recognizing the power of the collective that we can make sense and rise out of the moment. Yes, there is a COVID-19 pandemic, but there is also an epidemic of love. This epidemic rips open our hearts, helping us feel vulnerable and connected and generous and compassionate. This is the epidemic that I hope continues to spread until it takes root in all of us. Another reason why Rabbi Akiva's Avinu Malkeinu prayer was so powerful was because he said it in the plural. Our God, have mercy on all of us. Avinu Malkeinu, we pray still today, be compassionate with us and with our children. Help us bring an end to sickness and war and famine. Move all humanity to end oppression in our midst. Forgive us, pardon us, and help us atone. We will not allow ourselves to live this moment as a series of individual tragedies. We will address it and name it and live it as the collective we are. Torah tells us that when the traumatized Israelites, recently freed from Egyptian slavery, tumbled into the desert, they sank into desperation. Thirsty, hungry, and scared, they prayed to God for help, and when a strange, white, milky substance fell from the sky, they looked one to the other and asked, "Manhu, what is it?" Throughout their time of wandering, they called the gift from God manna, for it appeared as if from nowhere, and then it was everywhere. In 1918, turning this biblical account on its head, a newspaper in Freetown suggested that the new horrific illness gripping its populace might also be called Manhu, for it too descended upon them as if from nowhere and seemed to be everywhere immediately. Manhu, we ask again today. What is all this? Friends, it's potential. It is 5781 knocking at the doors to our souls, saying, open wide, live out the connecting, pulsating through all of us. Be a force of good. Make this year a blessing. Like our ancestors, we too dash about, picking up the sustenance around us, sharing it with our neighbors, and believing that the promised land is still ahead. together. Together, we will spread an epidemic of love. Shana Tova.